Back in our foraging days, hundreds of thousands of years ago, it made sense for our bodies to retain energy-rich fat because you never knew when you'd get an opportunity for more. You might need to live off that roasted shank of mammoth for, who knows, a long time before you hunted down another.
But today, for many of us, our relationship to food has dramatically changed, while our genes have not. We live in a time of considerable comestible abundance, and that has consequences. I mean, put it this way. If you're never more than a few minutes from chowing down on a bacon cheeseburger or a pint of chocolate banana ice cream, you've noticed that instant gratification has left its calling card on.
Too Much of a Good Thing is the title of Lee Goldman's book about the many modern illnesses brought about by our once beneficial ancestral genes. The cardiologist and dean of the medical school at Columbia University says this includes not just obesity, but, and perhaps surprisingly, depression.
So our bodies are extraordinarily efficient at storing the fat that we like to eat whenever food is available and whenever it's plentiful. That's great for the Paleolithic era. But today it explains why 38% of Americans are frankly obese. That means they're more than 30% overweight. Another one-third are overweight. It's because we eat more than we need to, and we store it as more fat than we need. And even worse, that excess fat, that excess weight, precipitates in many of us what's called type 2 diabetes. And now close to 15% of Americans have diabetes because they weigh too much.
So this is actually hardwired, this behavior, the fact that I want that dish of French fries.
Exactly. So our eating habits are largely hardwired. Our tongues, our taste buds, love sugar, salt, and the consistency of fatty foods, as well as protein. That drives most of our eating habits. The more those foods are available, especially in calorie-dense modern foods, the more we eat. So the inability to stay on a diet and to lose weight is not usually a result of moral weakness. It's because food is available and we want it. And even worse, if you try to lose weight, you actually get hungrier and your body slows down your metabolism so you won't lose the weight. Those were great survival advantages in the Paleolithic era when food was in short supply. That helped our ancestors get through those tough times. We now have those same genes today, even though we really don't want them. Since the Industrial Revolution, the amount of exercise people perform has gradually declined. Some people have increased their leisure time physical activity, but the actual amount of activity performed in Western societies like America has declined because there's so much less in the way of occupational physical activity. Not only that, people commonly overestimate how many calories they burn. You can run a treadmill for a half an hour or more and burn fewer calories than a single Starbucks muffin.
You also talk about the role of salt. Today we eat too much salt. We suffer from high blood pressure. I mean, obviously they're right.
So for most of human history, salt has been more valuable than gold. And the reason is that of all the animals, our biggest advantage is that we have the best endurance. We aren't the fastest runners, but we can go the longest. A cheetah is the fastest runner, but if you put a cheetah on a treadmill, it'll run for about a mile or a mile and a half, lie down on the treadmill and roll off, because its temperature has risen to 107 degrees and it simply can't go any further. We keep our body temperatures from getting that high because we can sweat, and the evaporation of the sweat cools us off. To do that, we have to have salt and water so that when we sweat, we don't get severely dehydrated. That's why people always craved salt and why we had to have water readily available. Terrific survival advantage back in the old days, but now the excess salt that we eat explains why one-third of Americans have high blood pressure.
Where would our ancestors have gotten salt, back in the hunter-gatherer days?
Well, they got most of their salt from eating animals. So it turns out that if you eat just animals, you'll do just fine. The point, though, is you have to eat the whole animal. Gnaw on the bones, eat the liver, eat everything. If you do that, you get everything you need. And that's how people got most of their salt. The problem with salt developed as people settled down and became farmers and might not have sufficient access to milk or meat. In those cases, they needed access to salt, and that's why people figured out how to get salt from salt rocks, salt water, etc. Interestingly, the Roman soldiers were often paid in salt. In fact, the word salary is derived from the Roman word sal for salt.
And what about high blood pressure? Because obviously that's related to salt. Are you saying that our ancestors probably didn't have it because they didn't have very much salt?
What we know is that if you look at still existing isolated hunter-gatherer tribes, their salt intakes are so low comparatively that they never develop a high blood pressure. Their salt intakes are sufficient to meet their losses through sweat and urine, but not anywhere nearly as high as what we have in the modern industrialized world.
One of the most interesting chapters in your book, Lee, and maybe that's because it's not quite as intuitive as the other sorts of things like obesity and high blood pressure and so forth, is modern fears, anxieties, depression, and you begin the discussion with considering murder. It turns out that our hunter-gatherer ancestors were maybe not quite so peaceful.
Though the, quote, peaceful savage, unquote, is a myth, lots of data show that in the Paleolithic era, about 15% of people died from trauma. We know that by looking at their skeletons. Most commonly, a gash in the left side of the head, most likely from a right-handed adversary. When people settled down and became farmers, as best we can tell, the violent death rate rose to 25% because there was more to fight about. We actually live in the safest time in the history of the world. Today, in America, more people die from suicide than from murder and war put together. But we still have the fears of the old days. And here's a good example. We are naturally afraid of spiders and snakes. You show a little kid a spider or a snake, and they're afraid. You show them a car or a gun, they're not afraid. In modern America, kids don't die from snakes and spiders. They die from cars and guns. But those aren't hardwired fear traits. We still have the fears that were built into our genes back in the Paleolithic era.
But getting back to murder for a moment, how was murder adaptive? I mean, what advantage did it give? I can imagine you could take your neighbor's mate or his food supply, but was there more to it than that?
The murderers were mostly men, and they got the woman, and they got whatever other assets came along with it. In many ways, we are the descendants of people who did or certainly were willing to murder other people. We're obviously not the descendants of people who got killed because in most times their entire families got killed as well. So we have that ability to be violent. In the modern world, that has to be suppressed because that's not socially appropriate.
But does that mean that, deep inside we're all murderers? Or maybe we all have murderous thoughts at least.
Hopefully, none of us are going to be murderers, but clearly studies show that if faced with a sufficient threat to themselves or their families, essentially everybody is willing to kill another person in order to save themselves or their family.
Okay, but that has clear survival value.
Survival.
But I could think that, okay, you might have a murder gene in you somewhere. I don't know, but if everybody had that, society really would fall apart if everybody's killing everybody else all the time. I mean, there's got to be some sort of equilibrium situation where not more than a few percent of the population is actually committing murders.
We don't know about any murder genes. I would just say that we have a strong survival trait, and really there are two things we commonly talk about in terms of that, fight or flight. But there's a third approach, and that's basically cower in submission and hope you don't get killed. And best as we can tell, that trait is what now links to the modern problems with depression. You cower, you become submissive, you don't fight back, you become very passive, and if you rebound to live and fight another day, that's adaptive. If you don't rebound, that's what we now call depression. But these fears of being killed, these traits to become submissive when fight or flight wouldn't work, they are, as best we can tell, the DNA that now leads to anxiety and depression, which are two of the leading causes of disability in modern America.
Well, it sounds like that's suggesting a treatment for anxiety and depression. Just become more aggressive.
Well, just becoming more aggressive is not socially appropriate. And so one of the conundrums of modern life is that you can't go too far in either direction.
Well, what's very interesting about this book, Lee, is that you've pointed out that some of the things that most trouble us today are hardwired into us. So, we think of good genes are those that keep us slim and happy, but those aren't the ones we have. So how do we beat this? I mean, it's like we're still driving century-old cars on 21st century freeways. We're born with all this genetic baggage, but it's not so easy to get rid of it, is it?
It's essentially impossible for us to evolve our genes to get out of this conundrum. We know that each of us has about 6 billion pieces of genetic information in our DNA, and we vary from our parents in about 60 of those 6 billion. Those are, in essence, typographical errors. If those typographical errors are beneficial, we pass them on to our children, and eventually they can spread more widely through the population. But that takes time, hundreds of generations. We don't have hundreds of generations to deal with these traits that are now killing us, so natural evolution is never going to get us there. Second possibility is we all change our behaviors. We become more virtuous. Well, some of us will be successful, but many won't, not because we're morally weak, probably because our genes are just stronger and make it more difficult for us to get there. And so I think behavior change is always worth trying, but we're fooling ourselves if we think that's going to be the worldwide solution. If it were, we wouldn't see so many more people becoming obese, hypertensive, anxious, and depressed. Could this happen with legislation? Some evidence that legislation to reduce the amount of salt in food can reduce salt intake. We certainly know that legislation to limit smoking can reduce smoking and, as a result, heart attacks. But we live in the land of the free, and we tend not to be very enthusiastic about limiting personal choice.
Well, what about the obvious? What about the techno fix? Reorganize our genes and so forth. Maybe the answer is designer babies that don't crave cheesecake, don't have high blood pressure, and don't get depressed.
Well, I'm a big fan of modern science. I get no money from the pharmaceutical industry, but I don't think this is about designer babies or gene editing. I think this is more about identifying genes we no longer need and finding ways to blunt or neutralize their effect. A good example that I use in my book is the PCSK9 gene. I think it's less about editing them out, which is very cumbersome and unlikely to be feasible in every one of us, but more about specific interventions that can blunt those genes we no longer need.
Lee Goldman, thank you so very much for being with us today.
My pleasure.
Lee Goldman is a cardiologist and dean of the medical school at Columbia University. His book is Too Much of a Good Thing: How 4 Key Survival Traits Are Now Killing Us.